If you would open up your Bible to the book of Numbers, chapter 26. We just got through some very interesting chapters. We looked at Balaam and all of Balaam's prophecies, and then Balaam's counsel to Balak, and the children of Israel suffered a great loss as a result of those events. And it's interesting now that we come out of chapter 25 and then we come into chapter 26, and chapter 26 is another census that the nation of Israel is taking. And you know, when we get to some of these chapters in the Bible, I know sometimes we just kind of gloss over and you know, you kind of read a chapter like this. We're just going to go through all the tribes of Israel. It's going to name all the families within the tribe of Israel, and then it's going to give us a number of how many men and from 20 years old and above that were in that tribe, and then it's going to give us a number of all of the men that were 20 and over. And the reason they do that is because they were taking a census of their army. They're going to lay out for us what had happened as the children of Israel came into the land. Now, if we remember back, if you've been with us for the last several months, the book of Numbers, chapter 1, was also a census. And the census in chapter 1 was just, you know, a year to 2 years after they had come out of Egypt to have a census. And now we're 38 years later having another census. And so, you know, you're looking at, you know, what had happened, all of these events as they were in the wilderness. And remember, what had happened is that the children of Israel didn't go into the promised land because of a lack of faith. They didn't believe that God was able to deliver the giants that were in the land into their hand. And so because of it, for 40 years, they're going to be wandering in the desert, just wandering around. And they're going to have to experience, you know, God's faithfulness. And then they would also experience God's holiness, as many of them would die. Everyone 20 years and older as they went out of Egypt would die. And now a whole new generation is being sent into the promised land. The only ones that were older was Caleb and Joshua, because these two men believed that God was able to deliver them, and they tried to convince the children of Israel that God was able to deliver them, but the children of Israel didn't believe, and so they didn't want to go in. Now, when we come to a chapter like this, when we come to chapter 26, you know, it's real easy to go, man, that's a lot. And I'm not going to kind of go through every name and every verse here. We're going to kind of highlight some of this, and then we'll cover chapter 26 and chapter 27. I remember hearing the story of a woman that was visiting a church on a Sunday. The sermon seemed to take forever. Many people in the congregation were beginning to doze off, and you know, and the pastor wouldn't take a hint. You start to see people doze off. You figure, okay, so I got to change something, right? But he didn't. He was just going for it, man. People sleeping. There was a couple people snoring. After the service, the woman who was visiting went to be, you know, friendly and be social, and she went up to a man who was very sleepy. And he said, hello. She said to him, hello, my name is Gladys Dunn. And the gentleman replied, you're not the only one, ma'am. I'm glad it's done too. I don't want to get to the end of the service and you're going, I'm glad it's done. So we're not going to read every verse here, but we're going to highlight some of this. And then I think there's some very incredible lessons placed in the middle of a census. It don't even make sense, right? But let's jump in. Chapter 26, beginning in the first verse, is, it came to pass after the plague that the Lord spoke to Moses and to Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the priest, saying, take a census of all the congregation of the children of Israel, from 20 years old and above, by their father's house, all who are able to go to war in Israel. So Moses and Eleazar, the priest, spoke with them in the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho, saying, now remember where they're at now. They're back to the very place that they started when they had that lack of faith. They're right there on the Jordan River. They had a eyes view of Jericho, and it would be the first battle that they would face. As they go into Jericho, you find that in Joshua, in the first 5 chapters of Joshua, the 6th chapter of Joshua, when they actually go in and they battle against Jericho. And what's incredible is that they're right on the border now. And God is telling them, look, we're going to take another census of all of the people that are now with you. And as he begins to go through that census, he's going to give us a very detailed picture of those who were in the camp. Look at verse 4. It says, take a census of the people from 20 years old, just as the Lord commanded Moses and the children of Israel who came out of the land of Egypt. And then he begins with the first tribe, Reuben, the firstborn of Israel. And I'm not going to bore you with reading all of the names, but I do want to make a note. Look at the end of verse 7 there. It says there were 43,730. Now, if you were to take the census in chapter 1 and you were to compare it, the tribe of Reuben was then 46,500, and so they had diminished by some 3,000. As 20 years old and above, there was 3,000 less in the tribe of Reuben. And then he's going to go from the tribe of Reuben to the tribe of Simeon. If you look in verse 12, there's the tribe of Simeon according to their families. And he gives us a list of the names of those families. And this is incredible because there's 22,200 in this tribe. This is what's wild. In the tribe that was the list that was given to us at the beginning of Numbers, there was 54,300. What's believed happened is that many of the tribe of Simeon were the ones who died in the rebellion that had taken place with the Midianite women. When the sin of the Midianite, many of the 24,000 people were speared and killed as a result of their immorality. And this tribe had diminished by nearly 30,000 people. And so you're looking at some of these tribes that had great influence and great power at one point, and now they've diminished in that influence and power because of sin. And then if you were to go down, you look at the sons of Gad. In the tribe of Gad, there's 40,500, and they now have increased to 45,600. And so this tribe actually had an increase of over 5,000 fighting soldiers, men 20 years and older. If you were to jump down to verse, let me look at the sons of Judah. Then let's look at that verse real quick. Look at verse 19. The sons of Judah, according to their families, the sons of Judah were and Onan, and and Onan died in the land of Canaan. It's again interesting that he would mention to us about and Onan, because and Onan, what we do know about and Onan, in 1 Chronicles chapter 2, in the 3rd verse, it tells us that the firstborn of Judah, was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and he was killed. and God killed him. And as you're looking at this genealogies, there's some things that kind of stand out. I think as they're looking at all the families and all the tribes, they're reminded that they serve a holy God. And because of sin, there's going to be a consequence that would come out. Many of their tribes had lessened in number. Some of their tribes had gained in number. But much of it was a result of the rebellion that they had partaken in against God. Guys, I think there's a principle here, man. God blesses those who honor him. And there's a consequence for those who dishonor him. We jumped over one of those. Look back in verse 9. And just as a reminder, look what it said in verse 9 there of chapter 26. The sons of Eli were Nemuel, Dathan, and Abiram. These are the Dathan and Abiram, representatives of the congregation who contended against Moses and Aaron in the company of Korah when they contended against the Lord. See, he's reminding them, look what's transpired while you guys were in the wilderness over these years. There was the rebellion of Korah. There was this man and Onan who were killed in Canaan. And as a result of it, these guys were not going to experience the promised land. They weren't going to experience the blessing of God upon their life. They were never going to get into the place where they had this great possession. And all of these numbers are going to equate to how much land that they would possess as they got into the promised land. This is why the census is taking place. We'll see that at the end of the chapter. And it's amazing because I think in the middle of this census, they're reminded once again, look what happens to a tribe, or look what happens to a nation whenever that nation decides that they're going to forsake truth and they're going to forsake God. And then look what happens to that tribe and to that nation that decides that they're going to honor God and they're going to hold on to truth. It's an evidence of God's faithfulness. And the children of Israel, think about if anybody should have known the faithfulness of God, it should have been the children of Israel. To think about what it would take. Guys, we're talking 2 to 3 million people living in a desert with oftentimes no water source, oftentimes no food source. And yet God would provide for them. Manna every morning. They would wake up and the breakfast and lunch and dinner were on the floor waiting for them. And they would just have to wake up, go gather enough for the day's meal, and then they would save enough for the day's meal, and they would be able to make food all day long with what God supplied that morning. And then on Friday, they would have 2 times the amount in order to have food for Friday and the Sabbath Saturday, because no manna would be provided on Saturday. If you don't know that's God, there's something wrong with you. You know what I'm saying? If you sit back and go, wait a second, how's all this coming? And then it tells us as soon as they got into the promised land, the manna ceased. You're just kind of going, wait a second, God was providing for us this whole time. Whenever they were thirsty, God would send Moses to bring water out of a rock. Right? All of a sudden there's no water, and then here comes Moses. He prays, he strikes the rock, and then water would come flowing out. You're kind of like, well, that's just a coincidence. I don't think so. You see, every day they would see the faithfulness of God, and yet in the middle of all of this, they decide that, we don't have to listen to Moses. We don't have to listen to God. We don't, we can do what we want to do. And we see these wicked men, we see these rebellious men, become examples to the children of Israel. Because when you go into the promised land, if you want God's blessing upon your tribe or upon your nation, then all you have to do is just surrender to Him, submit to Him. And He's trying to teach them, even through the census, he's showing these very lessons to the children of Israel. Look at verse 23. It tells us that the sons of Issachar. Now this is an interesting tribe, the sons of Issachar. We find out there in verse 25 that there were 54,400, and then we find that before them were, in the last census, there were 64,000, 10,000 less men. The sons of Zebulun, it tells us in verse 26, and it tells us there were 60,500 of them, and now there's 57,000 of them, or there was 57,000, so they've had an increase of a couple of thousand. And then you got the sons of Manasseh, 52,700, and earlier census there was 32,200. So again, another decrease of 20,000 men. And every one of these tribes, would have been, aware, man, we've lessened in power over the last 38 years because of the census that was taken before the 38 years had passed. And then we come to another tribe, the tribe of Benjamin. The tribe of Benjamin in verse 38, in verse 41, we're told that there was 45,600. In the last census, there was 35,000. They had an increase of 10,000. And all of this is going to become important when they begin to divide up the land, because depending on the size of your tribe would be the amount of land you would be allotted. And so now this census becomes a very important document, because they're going to go into the tribe, and if you had many in your tribe, then you would have a greater amount of land mass in order to build and to develop and to make your land. And so the census continues there with Dan. Dan had 64,400 prior. They had 62,700. Asher had 53,000, and prior they had 41,000. So they had increased by some 12,000. And then you come to Naphtali, and Naphtali had 45,000, and prior they had 53,400. And they had a decrease of some 8,000. But here's the incredible thing as you look at verse 51. It says, these are those who were numbered of the children of Israel, 601,730. And prior, there was 603,550. And there was only a decrease of over 2,000 soldiers in their army. In other words, they still had a very vibrant army, over 600,000 soldiers, as they were going to go into the promised land. And I think all of it, the grace of God, man, being displayed to the children of Israel in spite of all of the things that they had done, in spite of all the failures that they had participated in, that God had still sustained them. And many of the tribes, changing in power or in number, but God still, bringing about, an army that was an incredible force that they would go into the promised land with. Now, when you come to verse 52, we find out the reason for the census. I told you we would come to that. Look what he says in verse 52. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, to these the land shall be divided as an inheritance according to the number of names. To a large tribe you shall give a larger inheritance, and to a small tribe you shall give a smaller inheritance. Each shall be given an inheritance according to those who were numbered of them. Now, the land allotment, or the amount of land that they would all receive would be according to the size of the tribe that they now had. So the bigger the tribe, the greater amount of land they would get. So the tribe with 32,000 would have less than the tribe of 52,000, or the tribe of 60,000 would have almost double the amount of land as one that had 32,000. But here's the incredible thing. Look at the next verse. Watch what he says here in verse 55. He says, but the land shall be divided by lot. They shall inherit according to the names of the tribes of their fathers. Now, the size of the land was going to be divided by the amount of land you would get was divided by the number of tribes. But which part of the land was going to be divided by lot? In other words, God was going to choose which tribe was going to be in what region. That wasn't up to them to do. That was God that was going to do it. And anytime they would cast lots, the lot was really representative of God making the decision for you. If you'd pick, it's like picking straws. That was kind of the idea of casting lots. You would just kind of pick the straw, and whatever straw you picked, that would be the region that you would be given. And then within that region, they would decide how much land you possessed. And so this is how God was going to divide it up. And then he tells us in verse 57 or 56, according to the lot, their inheritance shall be divided between the larger and the smaller. And these are those who were numbered of the Levites. Now, all of the tribes, you have 12 tribes already, and then the Levites would make 13. And the reason there was 13 is because Joseph's sons, both Manasseh and Ephraim, were also divided so that they got a lot each, or they got an inheritance each. But now the Levites are going to not get their own land. The Levites would be the ones that were ministering at the temple. And so they would not have an inheritance. Their life was to be serving and ministering to the Lord. And so they were going to, use their time to work the land or to build houses. Their time would be used in the service to the Lord. And what would happen is that the children of Israel would all give a tenth, a tithe, and their tithe would support the needs of the Levites so that the Levites could devote their time to the service of the Lord. That's where this whole idea of the Levites and the priest would be supported by those who were working the land and who were raising the cattle, and they would bring offerings and they would bring their tithe, they would bring all of these things so that the Levites were able to survive. But the Levites weren't investing their life in an inheritance. They were investing their life in the service of the Lord. And so the Levites aren't included in the dividing of the land. Look what it says in verse 56. Or 57 it is. And these are those who were numbered of the Levites according to their families of Gershon, the families of the Gershonites, the Kohath, and the families of the Kohathites, and of Merari, the family of the Merarites. These are the families of the Levites, the families of the Libnites, the family of the Hebronites. I told you I was going to read no names. We're going down further, because I'm messing up half of them. But if you think I said it right, then I did. Okay. Verse 16, and to Aaron were born Nadab and Abihu, Eleazar and Ithamar. And Nadab and Abihu died when they offered profane fire before the Lord. Again, we're reminded of an event that had taken place. It's interesting that he kind of, in the census, he's kind of throwing out, remember what happened at the rebellion of Korah? Remember with when he sinned against the Lord and he was a wicked guy? Remember what had happened to these guys, Nadab and Abihu? They had brought a sacrifice of incense. They had placed incense, but it was profane incense. The Lord never told them to do it. And because of it, they died. It tells us in the book of Leviticus chapter 10. Let me just read you the story. I think it's interesting. It says, the Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer and he put fire in it, put incense on it, and offered profane fire before the Lord, which the Lord had not commanded them. So fire went out from the Lord, devoured them, and they died before the Lord. And Moses and Aaron said, this is what the Lord spoke, saying, by those who come near me, I must be regarded as holy, and before all the people, I must be glorified. So Aaron held his peace. We don't know what these two boys did, but they did something that was profane in the eyes of God. And God said, I'm a holy God, and you can't worship me in any way you prescribe or you desire to worship me. You worship me the way I prescribe for you to worship me. And it was a very visual lesson for the children of Israel that God is worshiped the way he prescribes. And it's interesting that they would be mentioned within the census as well. Notice verse 62. Those who were numbered of them were 23,000, every male from a month old and above, for they were not numbered among the other children of Israel, because they had no inheritance to give to them among the children of Israel. These are those who were numbered by Moses and Eleazar the priest, who numbered the children of Israel in the plains of Moab by the Jordan across from Jericho. But among these there was not a man of those who was numbered by Moses and Aaron the priest. Now remember, Moses and Aaron were the ones who had numbered them back in chapter 1 of the book of Numbers. Now it's Moses and Eleazar, the high priest, because Aaron has died. And so he says, this is a whole different number, and no one that was in that old number is included in this number, because everyone 20 years older had died. And so again, another reminder that when you don't walk by faith, man, you don't enter the promised land. And it was a visual, because every one of those that were 20 years and older, their parents had already passed. because of their lack of faith. And they're once again reminded. Look what it says in verse 65, and then there's a reminder of God's faithfulness. Watch what he says in verse 65. For the Lord had said to them, they shall surely die in the wilderness. So there was not left a man of them except for Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, the son of Nun. Joshua and Caleb are the only two men that were in the number when Aaron numbered them and in the number when Eleazar numbered them, because these two men were willing to walk by faith, to trust the Lord, to say, you know what, I don't care who those guys are, they can't stand against the Lord, man. We can go in and take these guys. And it's again that I love Caleb. He's one of my favorite Bible characters, one of my favorite Bible men, because you look at Caleb, and when he's 80 years old, he was 40 years old when they left Egypt, and he's 80 years old by the time they get into the promised land. And when he comes in the promised land, he says, hey, give me the mountain country, man, because it was the hardest battle to win. And he said, you know what, I want the hardest battle. And he goes, I feel like even though I'm 80, I feel like I'm 40. That is quite a testimony. I would love to feel like I'm 40 when I'm 80. I don't know about you. So I'm in my 50s now, and I go, man, I feel like I'm in my 60s sometimes. But you realize, think about this guy. He's just like, man, I'm just as strong as I was when we first got here. I'm ready to take on the hardest battle. I'm willing to go into the highest ground. I'm willing to fight the biggest giants that you bring me, because God's with me. And you have a man here in Caleb that wasn't going to shrink back from any battle, because he believed that God was able to win the battle. And he believed it 40 years earlier, and he believed it 40 years later, man, that God is able to handle the battle he was going to face. And so we have the testimony of Caleb, and you have the testimony of Joshua. And we're going to see Joshua here in a second. Look at chapter 27. Now that we got through that census pretty easy, didn't we? I wasn't that brutal. All right, no one's snoring on me. That's good. We come to chapter 27, and we have an interesting account here. Look what it says. And they came to the daughters of Zelophehad, the son of Heifer. Now, if you're the son of a heifer, you're in trouble. The son of Gilead, the son of Machir, the son of Manasseh, from the families of Manasseh, the son of Joseph. And these were the names of his daughters: Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. And they stood before Moses and before Eleazar the priest and before the leader of all the congregation by the doorway of the tabernacle of meeting, saying, our father died in the wilderness, but he was not in the company of those who gathered together against the Lord in company with Korah, but he died in his own sin, and he had no sons. Why should the name of our father be removed from among his family because he had no son? Give us a possession among our father's brothers. So Moses brought their case before the Lord. These young ladies, what an incredible faith that they possessed. Here's these gals. They were the daughter. Their dad, Zephilahad, that guy, had died. But they bring it to Moses' attention. Look, Moses, look, our dad died. He wasn't in the rebellion of Korah. He died for some other sin. I thought that was interesting. They were just like, he wasn't in that sin, but he had his own sin going on, and that's why he died. But that's not, this isn't right. Is there any way that we can get the inheritance of our father so that our father's name isn't erased away from the nation of Israel. And these gals demonstrated a great faith. Not only did they go and ask Moses, but they believed that they were going to go into the promised land, and there was going to be a lot of land that would be provided to the children of Israel. And they were willing to go before Moses and say, Moses, look, we want an inheritance when we get there. Think about all the other men who had died because they didn't believe the Lord that they were going to go into the promised land, that they were going to be defeated. These gals believed that God was going to give them the land. And because they believed, they were willing to ask. And I think there's something to that in our own faith. You know, if you're willing to ask God, God's able to answer your prayer. It takes faith to ask. It takes faith to pray. There's some amount of faith that it takes for you to go, God, this is my situation, and I know that situation is outside of my control and my ability to change anything, but I know it's not outside your control and your ability to change anything, so I'm going to come to you and I'm going to ask God that you would help or you would intervene. That's all that prayer is. It's going before the God who's able to change things. It tells us in the book of Matthew chapter 7 and verse 7, it says this, ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you'll find. Knock and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it will be opened. Guys, that is the simple prescription that God gives for every one of his children. You go and ask God. You go and seek God's will. You go and start knocking for God to answer. And everyone who does so will receive what he's asking, what he's seeking, what he's knocking for. And what's amazing about this whole picture is that these girls demonstrated a great faith to go before Moses, and not only to go before Moses, but to say, we want an inheritance when we go into the land. And notice what happens. Moses saying, I don't know what to do with this. I'm going to go ask the Lord, God, what should we do with this? And then it says, the Lord spoke to Moses, verse 6. And the Lord said, the daughter of Zephilahad, speak what is right. You shall surely give them a possession of inheritance among their father's brothers, and to cause the inheritance of their father to pass to them. And you shall speak to the children of Israel, saying, if a man dies and he has no son, then you shall cause his inheritance to pass to his daughter. If he has no daughter, then you shall give his inheritance to his brothers. If he has no brothers, then he shall give his inheritance to his father's brothers. And if his fathers have no brothers, then he shall give the inheritance to the relative closest to him in his family, and he shall possess it, and it shall be to the children of Israel a statute of judgment, just as the Lord commanded Moses. Man, what an incredible picture it lays out for us, man, of the grace of God. Even though the father had sinned, the children are still going to receive the inheritance because they asked. And you guys, no matter what upbringing you had, no matter what your mom and dad did or your grandma and grandpa did in your past, you see, what they did doesn't affect what you do. Because God is a God of grace, and anyone who comes and asks, he's willing to work in their life. The grace of God. That God isn't holding you down for whatever, the past was. He's looking at what's your present. Whatever your past is, it isn't going to dictate what your future is. And whatever the past of your family is, it's not going to dictate what the future of your life is going to be. Because God operates on a personal level, and these gals are willing to go in and they're willing to say, look, man, we want to be part of this. We want, to have an inheritance. We want to see God work in our own lives, and we want to be able to pass that on, our Father's name, to our children. Now the way that it would work is that the men would be the ones who would receive the inheritance. The wife would marry someone from the other tribe, and then they would bear children, and their children would receive the inheritance of their father. And so the women would never get the inheritance. They would get the inheritance of their father, and their children would get the inheritance of the father. But if there's no son here, he's saying now, the inheritance we pass to the daughter. And it was something that was not part of how Israel dealt with things, but now God comes in because these women are willing to ask. God changes, the law for them so that they're able to now to receive the inheritance of their father, and it's all the grace of God. And then we jump to verse 12. In verse 12, and this whole picture, we're now changing. We're really, if you look at this whole passage, it's God saying, we're about to have a new start now. A new generation is coming. The old generation's past, and a new generation's coming. The old generation in chapter 1 of Numbers is no longer, but this new generation in chapter 26 is the ones who's going to take the promised land, who's going to go into this promised land, and with it, he's going to tell us there's going to be a new leader. He's going to pass the baton from Moses to Joshua. Notice as the Lord now in verse 12 speaks to Moses, and the Lord said to Moses, go up into the mountain of Abiram and see the land which I have given to the children of Israel. And when you have seen it, you shall be gathered to your people as Aaron your brother was gathered. For in the wilderness of Zin, during the strife of the congregation, you rebelled against my command to hallow me at the waters before their eyes. These are the waters of Meribah at Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin. Now Moses wasn't going to go into the promised land because he misrepresented the Lord. God told Moses very, very clearly, Moses, you're going to go over to the rock. You're going to speak to the rock. You're not going to strike the rock. You're going to speak to the rock. And Moses gets there and he's furious. The children of Israel, after all of this time, it's still complaining, still murmuring, still crying that God isn't giving them the water they need or the food. And Moses gets the rock. He has a staff and he just starts, beating the rock. And he represented God as an angry God. And God didn't want to be represented as an angry God. He wanted to be represented as a gracious God and a loving God. And because of it, Moses will not enter the promised land. And I think there's even a bigger picture here, guys, is that the law is what Moses represented, could never get you to the promised land. Joshua, who's going to be the picture of Jesus, is the one who's going to lead them into the promised land. The law can't get you to the promised land. Only Jesus can get you to the promised land. And this is going to become a very clear picture as we go through this. Now Moses understands, look, I blew it. I'm not going to go into the promised land. Now, it doesn't mean Moses isn't going to heaven. It just means Moses wasn't going to go into the physical land that God had promised the children of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And as a result of it, Moses has a request for the Lord. One of the things you find amazing as you're looking at the scripture is that even though Moses knows that, he's never going to get there, Moses still had a real concern for the people. He had a real concern for God's people, for the children of Israel. And because of his concern for the children of Israel, even though he wasn't going to lead them into the land, he's going to make a request to the Lord. And look what he does in verse 15. And Moses spoke to the Lord, saying, let the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, set a man over the congregation, who may go out before them and go in before them, who may lead them out and bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord may not be like sheep which have no shepherd. Wow. Moses going, God, I know I'm going to die. I know that my time has come. Remember, at this point, Moses is over 120 years old now. He's on his last days. God's already told him, I want you to go up. You can go up to the mountain. You can look over Jericho. You can look at all of the beautiful land that I'm about to give to the people. But Moses, you're not going in. And Moses says, Lord, I just have one request of you. Would you make sure that there's a shepherd that's going to lead the children of Israel into the land? Guys, Joshua at this point is going to become the shepherd for the children of Israel. But we're going to find out that he wasn't the complete shepherd that Moses is asking for, because they're going to fall short of conquering the land. They're not going to take all the land that they were given. They're going to allow the enemy to stay in the land. So Joshua doesn't fulfill the role completely. David will come on the scene, and David was a young shepherd boy. And David is going to become the shepherd of Israel, the king of Israel. And he's going to conquer more than any of the other kings. He's going to actually take the land that was given. But David falls short of being the shepherd. Remember when Nathan had come to David? Now David had sinned against the Lord, and he had committed adultery with Bathsheba. And instead of going out to war, which he normally did, he stood home. And David was there, when everyone was out at war, he was there standing on his balcony, and he's overlooking on his balcony, and he sees a woman down there, and she was beautiful to behold. And he starts thinking, man, I sure would like that gal to come and keep me company. And he inquires about her, and then he invites her into his house, and he has sexual relationships with Bathsheba, and she gets pregnant. And David, trying to hide his sin, he calls her husband home off the battlefield, thinking that if he can go and sleep with her, then no one will ever know that that baby was his. And so David has her husband come home. Nathan, the prophet, comes to him. And he begins to tell him, David, what are you doing? What are you doing? Because as her husband came home, he tried to have him go home, but he says, you know what? All my men are out there at battle, and I'm going to come home and sleep with my wife. I'm not going to do it. And he ends up sleeping on the porch of the castle. And David's going, man, he's not going to go home. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to get him drunk, and if I get him drunk, for sure he'll go home. He gets him drunk, and he passes out before he gets home. And David's furious. Now you're like, what am I going to do, man? Now I'm going to get caught because I've slept with his wife, and so what am I going to do? And so what he does is he writes a letter to his commander, and he says, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to have you, and he was going to have her husband carry the letter to the commander, and in the letter it says, I want you to go to battle, and I want you to pull back, and I want her husband to die. And the commander does exactly what David asked him to do. And as King David thinks he got away with his sin, Nathan the prophet comes to him and says, David, I got a problem. I want to share with you what's going on. He says, there was a man, and he had one ewe lamb, and he loved that little ewe lamb. It was like his own daughter. And a rich man down the street had company. And while his company was there, he decided he was going to take the poor man's ewe lamb, and he was going to cook it, and he was going to feed it to his guest. And David was furious. He says, that man shall die. And then Nathan turns to him and he says, David, you are that man. You took the sheep that you were entrusted and the power that you were given, and you abused it by taking another man's wife. You were supposed to be a shepherd who was caring for the people, but instead you were a shepherd who was caring for himself. And so David wasn't the shepherd that God would have rule over the nation of Israel. That shepherd isn't going to be completed until Jesus comes on the scene. And this in John chapter 10, I'm going to ask you to turn there real quick. Go to John chapter 10. Watch what Jesus says in John chapter 10. Verse 11. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. But a hireling, he who is not the shepherd, one who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming, and he leaves the sheep and he flees, and the wolf catches the sheep and scatters them. The hireling flees because he's a hireling and he does not care about the sheep. I'm the good shepherd, and I know my sheep, and I'm known by my own. As the Father knows me, even so I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. You see, that's the shepherd that Moses is asking to lead the children of Israel. The good shepherd, the one who isn't concerned for his own life, but he's concerned for the life of others. He's concerned about the life that's being threatened, the life that's being attacked, the life that's being destroyed. You see, Jesus, the good shepherd, is the only one who's able to take us to the promised land. He's the only one who's able to satisfy the soul. He's the only one who's able to pay the payment for sin. He's the only one who can give us access to the Father. There's no other shepherd that can do that. One of the things that God promised the nation of Israel is that he would send them a good shepherd. And it was after David had failed. It's found in the book of Ezekiel. Again, turn to Ezekiel chapter 34. Man, this passage just always fascinates me in the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel chapter 34. Got Jeremiah, then you have Lamentations, and then you have the book of Ezekiel. And then you come to the 34th chapter. And there in the 34th chapter, watch what God says concerning the shepherds of Israel. And the word of the Lord came to me, saying, verse 1. Verse 2 says, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, Thus says the Lord God to the shepherds, Woe to the shepherds of Israel who feed themselves. Should not the shepherds feed the flocks? You eat the fat, you clothe yourselves with the wool, you slaughter the fatlings, but you do not feed the flock. The weak you have not strengthened, nor have you healed those who were sick, nor bound up the broken, nor brought back that which was driven away, nor sought what was lost, but with force and with cruelty you have ruled them. So they were scattered because there was no shepherd. And they became food for all the beasts of the field when they were scattered. My sheep wandered through the mountains and every high hill. Yes, my flock was scattered over the whole face of the earth, and one was seeking and no one was seeking or searching for them. Verse 7. Therefore, you shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. As I live, said the Lord, surely because my flock became prey, my flock became food for every beast of the field, because there was no shepherd, nor did my shepherd search for my flock. But the shepherd fed themselves, and they did not seek my flock. Therefore, O shepherds, hear the word of the Lord. Thus says the Lord God, Behold, I'm against the shepherds, and I will require my flock at their hand. I will cause them to cease feeding the sheep, and the shepherds shall feed themselves no more. For I will deliver my flock from their mouths, and they may no longer be food for them. Look at verse 11. For thus says the Lord God, Indeed, I myself will search for my sheep and seek them out, as a shepherd seeks out his flock on that day He is among his scattered sheep. So I will seek out my sheep, and I will deliver them from all the places where they've been scattered on a cloudy and a dark day, and I will bring them out from the people, and I will gather them from the countries, and I will bring them to their own land, and I will feed them on the mountains of Israel, in the valleys and the inhabited places, and in the country. Check this out. And I will feed them in a good pasture, and their fold shall be on the high mountain of Israel. They shall lie down in a good fold and feed in rich pasture on the mountains of Israel. I will feed my flock, and I will make them lie down, says the Lord, and I will seek what was lost, and I will bring what was driven away, bind up the broken, strengthen what was sick, and I will destroy the fat and the strong, and feed them in judgment. As for you, O my flock, thus says the Lord, behold, I shall judge between sheep, and between rams and goats. Guys, this is the fascinating thing. Ezekiel is promising that a good shepherd would come one day. And Moses, as he's praying this prayer there in Deuteronomy, as he's asking the Lord, God, would you send a shepherd so that the children of Israel would be they wouldn't be wandering, they wouldn't be prey. So they wouldn't be a people that have no shepherd. And the thing that Jesus wants to be, he wants to be your shepherd. He wants to be the one who leads you, who protects you, who feeds you, who cares for you, who's constantly there to sustain you in whatever you're going through in life. He's the good shepherd. Now Joshua is going to become a type of Jesus, especially when we get into the book of Joshua. It's incredible because when we get to the book of Joshua, Joshua is now in this picture or in this role as being one who's leading the children of Israel, but his real picture is that he's what Jesus is to us. And so we'll be looking at that as we get into the book of Joshua down the road here. We go back to Numbers, and we'll wrap it up here. Look at Numbers chapter 27. Look at verse 18, and he says this. And the Lord said to Moses, take Joshua, the son of Nun, with you, a man in whom is the Spirit, and lay your hands on him. Set him before Eleazar the priest, and before all the congregation, and inaugurate him in their sight. And you shall give some of your authority to him, and all the congregation of the children of Israel may be obedient. He shall stand before Eleazar the priest, and you shall inquire before the Lord for him by the judgment of the Urim. At his word they shall go out, and at his word they shall come in, he and all the children of Israel with him, and all the congregation. Now it's interesting that Moses was going to give some of his power, or some of his influence, some of his authority to him. He wasn't going to give all of it, because remember, Moses talked to God face to face. Joshua is going to talk to him through the priest. And the thing about Jesus is that Jesus is not just the king, but he's also the priest, right? He's the fulfillment of what Joshua in the Old Testament wasn't, even though he's the type. And he's going to, now every time they wanted direction from the Lord, they were going to go to the priest. The priest would have the Urim, which would tell them yes or no, or the Urim would guide them. And so as they were there, being directed by the Lord, it wasn't like Moses would talk to God face to face. Now he would go to the priest, and the priest would give him direction, as Joshua would go to the priest and ask for direction. But now Joshua is going to take over. And Moses comes to the end of his ministry, the end of his task that was given to him. And so we've looked at, up until this point, we're still a little bit away from entering the promised land, because we're going to have what it means to have fellowship with God. And he's going to remind them about having fellowship with God as we get through 28, 29, and 30. And then we're going to see that the Midianites are going to have a consequence for what they did to the children of Israel in stumbling them. We'll find that in chapter 31. And then we're going to see them begin to settle on this side of the Jordan, and some of the tribes, 2.5 of the tribes, are going to say, we don't want to go to the promised land. We want to stay on this side of the Jordan, and they're going to be given that ability to stay on that side of the Jordan. And then, Moses continues to give them instruction. But here we come really to the end of Moses' ministry. Look what he says in verse 22. So Moses did as the Lord commanded him. He took Joshua, he set him before Elijah the priest and before the congregation. He laid his hands on him and inaugurated him just as the Lord commanded by the hand of Moses. It was the passing of the baton. It was Moses' ministry completed, Joshua's ministry beginning. Now, Joshua's ministry didn't begin here. You see, Joshua was serving Moses for the last 40 years. He was a servant. He just really was, God, Moses, whatever you want me to do, that's what I'm going to do. And really, he was one who was holding up the hands of Moses. He was the one that was, by Moses' side. And now Moses is going off the scene, but God now is raising up a Joshua to take over. You guys, when it comes to serving the Lord, it always begins with servanthood. It always begins with, God, I'm willing to do whatever it is. And oftentimes in ministry, we're holding up other people's hands. And as you're being faithful with the little things, God's entrusted you with greater things. And Joshua becomes a great picture of that. He'd been faithful with the little things. And now Joshua is going to be entrusted with a great responsibility of leading 2 million people into the promised land. 600,000 soldiers into war, as they would now begin to conquer the enemy, as they would go into Jericho, as they would go into Ai, as they would begin to take over, all of the different territories, and then they would eventually get into Jerusalem, and they would win, that battle, and they would see God go before them against way more powerful armies than they had, because they were going to put their trust in the Lord. And I think, man, that there's some incredible lessons for all of us. Guys, it just really reminds me of how faithful God is in every arena to those who trust him. No matter what you're going through or what you've been through or what you're heading into, that you have a God who's faithful. It's been said of trials, man. You're either coming out of a trial, you're either in a trial, or you're about to get into a trial. It seems like it's just either one or the other. You're just like, oh, I just got out of that, and you have a little bit of relief. And then there's other times where like, I'm in the middle of it right now. And then you don't even know it, but man, right around the corner, there's something. And if you don't have a shepherd to guide you through those things, then those things really become your demise. They become, something that overwhelms you. And the good shepherd has a desire to lead you through those things. I'm reminded of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? They were in the middle of a fire. And the king saw it. He had thrown them into the fire. And he goes, man, didn't we just throw 3 guys in there? How come there's 4 standing? How come I see 4? And the 4th one looks like the Son of Man. I love that story, because you realize that even when you're in the midst of the fire, man, you have a good shepherd that's there with you to guide you through it. The king says, hey, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, why don't you guys come here? I want to talk to you. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, hey, king, why don't you come in here with us? No. They come out, and it says, not one hair of their head was singed. None of their clothes smelled like smoke. These guys come out, and they're like, hey, man, that was a nice sauna. And the king said, I'm making a new decree. Everyone in the land has to worship the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Because he saw that their God was bigger than his fire And guys, when the world looks at us and we've gone through a fire and they go, man, there's no smoke, there's no smell, there's no singe, their God must be bigger than anything that we can throw at them. And it's an incredible testimony of God's faithfulness. And whatever you're going through, man, understand something. Your shepherd's with you. If you'll just ask him, if you'll just trust him, if you'll just seek him, if you'll just knock, and he'll be right there to see you through the fire.